Now.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The credit crunch is spreading to financial markets around the world. Nearly 160,000 jobs were lost here in the United States in September. That's not including losses directly resulting from the financial meltdown. Wall Street might be breathing a little easier since Congress passed the more than $700 billion bailout plan Friday, but there are no signs of an easy or quick recovery. Today, we take a look back at the economic philosophy that championed the kind of deregulation that led to this crisis. We spend the hour with investigative journalist and author Naomi Klein, best-selling author of The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. Naomi Klein spoke at the University of Chicago last week, invited by a group of faculty opposed to the creation of an economic research center called the Milton Friedman Institute. It has a $200 million endowment and is named after the university's most famous economist, the leader of the neoliberal Chicago School of Economics.
When Milton Friedman turned 90, the Bush White House held a birthday party for him, to honor his legacy, in 2002. And everyone made speeches, including George Bush. But there was a really good speech that was given by Donald Rumsfeld. I have it on my website. My favorite quote in that speech from Rumsfeld is this. He said, "Milton is the embodiment of the truth that ideas have consequences." So what I want to argue here is that, among other things, the economic chaos that we're seeing right now on Wall Street and on Main Street and in Washington stems from many factors, of course, but among them are the ideas of Milton Friedman and many of his colleagues and students from this school. Ideas have consequences. More than that, what we are seeing with the crash on Wall Street, I believe should be for Friedmanism what the fall of the Berlin Wall was for authoritarian communism, an indictment of an ideology. It cannot simply be written off as corruption or greed, because what we have been living since Reagan is a policy of liberating the forces of greed, to discard the idea of the government as regulator, of protecting citizens and consumers from the detrimental impact of greed. Ideas that, of course, gained great currency after the market crash of 1929, but that really what we have been living is a liberation movement, indeed the most successful liberation movement of our time, which is the movement by capital to liberate itself from all constraints on its accumulation. So as we say that this ideology is failing, I beg to differ. I actually believe it has been enormously successful, just not on the terms that we learn about in University of Chicago textbooks. That I don't think the project actually has been the development of the world and the elimination of poverty. I think this has been a class war waged by the rich against the poor. And I think that they won, and I think the poor are fighting back. This should be an indictment of an ideology. Ideas have consequences. Now, people are enormously loyal to Milton Friedman for a variety of reasons and from a variety of sectors. You know, in my cynical moments, I say Milton Friedman had a knack for thinking profitable thoughts. He did. His thoughts were enormously profitable. And he was rewarded. His work was rewarded. I don't mean personally greedy. I mean that his work was supported at the university, at think tanks, in the production of a 10-part documentary series called Freedom to Choose, sponsored by FedEx and Pepsi. That the corporate world has been good to Milton Friedman because his ideas were good for them. But he also was clearly a tremendously inspiring teacher. And he had a gift, like all great teachers do, to help his students fall in love with the material. But he also had a gift that many ideologues have, many staunch ideologues have, and I would even use the word fundamentalists have, which is the ability to help people fall in love with a perfect imagined system, a system that seems perfect, utopian, in the classroom, in the basement workshop, when all the numbers work out. And he was, of course, a brilliant mathematician, which made that all the more seductive, which made those models all the more seductive, this perfect, elegant, all-encompassing system, the dream of the perfect utopian market. Now, one of the things that comes up again and again in the writings of University of Chicago economists of the Friedman tradition, people like Arnold Harbinger, is this appeal to nature, to a state of nature, this idea that economics is not a political science, or not a social science, but a hard science on par with physics and chemistry. So as we look at the University of Chicago tradition, it isn't just about a set of political and economic goals like privatization, deregulation, free trade, cuts to government spending. It's a transformation of the field of economics from being a hybrid science that was in dialogue with politics, with psychology, and turning it into a hard science that you could not argue with, which is why you'd never talk to a journalist, right? Because that's, you know, the messy, imperfect real world. It is beneath those who are appealing to the laws of nature. Now, these ideas in the 1950s and 60s at this school were largely in the realm of theory. They were academic ideas, and it was easy to fall in love with them because they hadn't actually been tested in the real world where mixed economies were the rule. Now, I admit to being a journalist. I admit to being an investigative journalist, a researcher, and I'm not here to argue theory. I'm here to discuss what happens in the messy real world when Milton Friedman's ideas are put into practice. What happens to freedom, what happens to democracy, what happens to the size of government, what happens to the social structure, what happens to the relationship between politicians and big corporate players. Because I think we do see patterns. Now, the Friedmanites in this room will object to my methodology, I assure you, and I look forward to that. They will tell you when I speak of Chile under Pinochet, Russia under Yeltsin and the Chicago Boys, China under Deng Xiaoping, or America under George W. Bush, or Iraq under Paul Bremer, that these were all distortions of Milton Friedman's theories, that none of these actually count when you talk about the repression and the surveillance and the expanding size of government and the intervention in a system which is really much more like crony capitalism or corporatism than the elegant, perfectly balanced free market that came to life in those basement workshops. We'll hear that Milton Friedman hated government interventions, that he stood up for human rights, that he was against all wars. And some of these claims, though not all of them, will be true. But here's the thing. Ideas have consequences. And when you leave the safety of academia and start actually issuing policy prescriptions, which was Milton Friedman's other life, he wasn't just an academic, he was a popular writer. He met with world leaders around the world, China, Chile, everywhere, the United States. His memoirs are a who's who. So when you leave that state safety and you start issuing policy prescriptions, when you start advising heads of state, you no longer have the luxury of only being judged on how you think your ideas will affect the world. You begin having to contend with how they actually affect the world, even when that reality contradicts all of your utopian theories. So to quote Friedman's great intellectual nemesis, John Kenneth Galbraith, Milton Friedman's misfortune is that his policies have been tried.
Naomi Klein, author of the best-selling book, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, will come back to her speech at the University of Chicago in a minute.
happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there. He's telling me I got to beware. It's time we stop. Hey, what's that?